So our presenter today is Dr. Bob Strong. He has over 45 years of experience in food industry. He has been working with us as a senior consultant and also a trainer. He has a PhD and BSc in chemistry, and he is a GMP HACCP HARPC instructor, literature training, and it's also certified to consult for GFSI standards. So welcome, Dr. Bob.
Thanks, Adriana, and welcome to everybody who's on the webinar. This is a follow-up, obviously, to a previous food defense webinar that we did, but we're now going to get into more details about how the FDA suggests that you do your calculations on your vulnerabilities as to whether you've got a serious vulnerability or you don't. So I'm going to talk about how to conduct those vulnerability assessments, where you have to do calculations based on the risk, which is severity and scale, using the three elements, which are potential impact on human health, access of the attacker to the product, and the ability of the attacker to be successful. Then how you make your decisions that this is a significant vulnerability or it is not. Because remember, you have to say it's not and why, not just when it is. And therefore, you have to have justification for including these vulnerabilities in your food defense plan or not. And then we'll finish up with some questions and answers. As we talked about in the previous webinar, the FDA has identified what they call key activity types. And they have indicated there are 4 that they're more concerned about. Now remember, that doesn't mean that because you don't have these, you don't need a food defense plan. But what it does mean, if you've got these, you have to have a very good, thought out food defense plan. And so therefore, one of the things that you need to identify is, do you have any of these 4 key activity types, like bulk liquid receiving, bulk liquid storage, secondary ingredient handling, or mixing and similar activities. And that's why this webinar is intended for food processors and not intended for food distributors. You couple that key activity types with the 3 elements, which is the public health impact that the attacker would be able to bring upon you if they were successful in contaminating your product. What is the accessibility that the attacker can get to your product to add something to it? What is the ability of them to do that and be successful? And then the FDA has a hybrid approach, which they recommend that you combine the key activity types with these 3 elements. A lot of this is going to be brief today, and that's why I would encourage you to attend the FDA's class that's being put together by FSPCA for intentional adulteration, in which that class is a 2-day class, and we'll go into great detail on how to do these assessments. But I will cover the type of things that you're going to find in that class. Obviously, we're talking about bulk liquid receiving. Your vulnerability concerns could be, but are not limited to the fact that you want sealed tankers bringing in the products, with every one of the inlets and outlets on that tanker sealed, and you have the ability to check that it has not been opened at any time since it left the supplier. Another concern could be that the incorrect product's in there and somebody has put in a product that would then contaminate your silos, contaminate product, and they could be successful that way. Making sure it comes from an approved supplier is a key, obviously, to the Food Safety Modernization Act, and therefore it's a key to this part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is preventing intentional adulteration. And conditions of the hoses, which we've talked about in the past, as to what could be in the hose, whether it be something deliberately put in the hose, whether it be allergens, etc. When it comes to receiving, obviously some of the key vulnerabilities could be involved with how do you receive, how do you hook up, who does the hookup, are you supervising it, Are you restricting the movement of delivery drivers if you allow them into your facility? Do you secure the transfer hoses in locked cabinets if you're using yours? Possibly use only your own hoses in order to decrease any vulnerability that could come from using the hoses that came with the bulk tanker. We're talking a little bit more about bulk liquid storage. Access to your silos. Are they inside or the outside? Can you get up on top of them? Can you open a hatch? Can you get in them from the bottom? Are they inside? Do you have them in a separate room? A room that would be potentially locked? These are the vulnerabilities that obviously you will be considering with regard to bulk liquid storage at your facility. So possible mitigation strategies could be install locks on tanks inside and outside. Put inside silos in a locked room. Restrict access to this room to only key individuals. Have cameras pointing at the door to the room that would record who is getting in the room, trying to get in the room, or who should not be going in the room, who's going in the room. When we talk about second ingredient handling, what is the FDA concerned about here? Obviously, people off to one side, working in a separate area, maybe a separate room, weighing out some of your ingredients that later are added to a big batch of product. A great opportunity to put something in those packages that is going to be harmful to the health of the consumer. Where do you pre-mix things? And how accessible is that to somebody who is an attacker who would want to add something deliberately to the product in order to contaminate a lot of product and to get people sick and possibly kill them? How are you protecting your rework, particularly if it's a liquid product? The reason why we keep coming back to liquids are easier to mix something into a liquid than it is to mix it into a powder. And sometimes it will automatically mix in the liquid, but with just a little agitation, which would take a lot more to mix it into a powder. How about return products? Do you allow return products to come back? If so, are they bulk products, where you shipped out a tanker of a bulk liquid, got to the other end, and your customer rejected it back to you? Did they reject it back to you without adding something to it? Or did it possibly get contaminated? So what the FDA sends you on all these things is, are you looking at where your product is vulnerable? Are you assessing how vulnerable it is? And what are you going to do about it to remove that vulnerability? Hence, this becomes your food defense plan. We're going to get into more detail in a minute about how they want you to do these calculations. Mixing and similar activities means, is there anything in your process which uses mix kettles? Uses areas where things are being mixed and something could be added at that stage? Do you have blending operations? Do you do grinding? In other words, do you have anything in your facility, in your process of your product, where there's an ability for somebody to add something to the product, and it could be mixed in, and this product would then be hazardous to the health of the consumer, causing multiple foodborne illnesses and potential deaths. Exposed product areas, by their definition, are where it's going to be more likely that somebody's going to add something to your product. So therefore, if your product's already packaged, it's already in sealed containers, then there's very little chance, unless somebody opens up a case, opens up a bag, opens up a pail, that they can put something in there. So it doesn't mean that those facilities with unexposed products do not have a food defense, but their food defense is going to be based on tamper evidence, tamper resistant, being able to see that somebody opens something up. But when you got exposed products, it's considerably different. So therefore, this risk assessment that we're going to talk about today is that you need to do a risk assessment. It's not something nice to do, you have to do it. And you have to do it of all the possible vulnerabilities that you could have in your facility, in your process, in the steps of your process. And you're determining the probability, therefore the likelihood, and the severity that it would be if somebody was able to do it, so that you can justify either invoking a mitigation strategy as an actual process step, or you're going to justify why not. And remember, the FDA wants the why nots in writing, as well as the reasons why you do something. They've also indicated the attacker is more likely to be an inside person, somebody working for you, somebody you've let into your facility like a contract service provider, somebody therefore who has the ability to get to your product. Now, what are they looking for? The attacker is looking to get a maximum effect from their actions. Therefore, they want to contaminate large amounts of product, not individual packages. So therefore, you would look at where you have everything in bulk or in mixes or in bulk silos, where if somebody added something, they would be able to contaminate a lot of product, and they would be able to contaminate a lot of your finished product by contaminating an ingredient or an in-process product. So what is the FDA requiring you to do? They require you to have a flow diagram showing your process from receiving all the way through to shipping. And on that flow diagram, you have to show what are those key activity types. So bulk receiving, bulk storage, ingredient mixing, weighing out of minor ingredients, etc. Those are then the steps where you will conduct the vulnerability assessments. If you're going to do the hybrid approach, you would then, having determined where your KATs are, you would then look at the three elements, which are the public health impact, accessibility to the product, and the ability of the attacker to be successful. The FDA, through this FSPCA class, has come up with a way for you to actually numerically assess this vulnerability as to whether it is a significant vulnerability or not. And that's what we're going to talk about. Because if it is a significant vulnerability, then you have to have a mitigation strategy. You have to have it in an actual process step, and you have to be obviously doing that. If you can determine that it is not significant, then the scoring again will indicate that, and that would be how you would indicate in your plan that it was not a significant vulnerability. So when you're doing the assessment, it is involving calculations. And the calculations are based on the following things. How much contaminant would the attacker need to add to cause multiple deaths and illnesses, which is their intent? They're not trying to change the flavor of your product or change the appearance of your product. They're trying not to do that. They're trying to make it so it looks like the normal product, but yet it's hazardous to the health of the consumer, and you're not going to be able to detect it, and nor is the consumer. So your next question is, how long would they need to do this and still not be observed? Therefore not have people in the plant wondering why this person's standing over at a place where they normally don't work for quite a period of time and appears to be doing something that seems a little unusual. The attacker obviously doesn't want to change the appearance of the product, because if it does, somewhere further down the line, somebody's going to say, this product doesn't look right. The color's changed, it's sticking together, something's happening to it. So if they're going to be successful, they need to obviously be sure that they don't change the appearance of the product where somebody would discover it. Therefore, the next question is, can the attacker be successful? Meaning, get enough time, be able to add enough of the contaminant, be able to make it so the product still looks the same, and be able to get the product out the door in order to get people sick and to possibly kill people. Now they talk about inherent characteristics and not inherent characteristics. So what are those? Those are some things that you do anyway as just part of your process. Like you may have a whole lot of people standing next to each other, all doing their job. Well, it's a little less likelihood that the attacker is going to try and do something with people standing to either side of them. Therefore, these are considered inherent characteristics. Maybe you have people who wear different colored smocks or hairnets so you can spot where they are when they are not where they need to be. These can be used as calculations of vulnerability. But they can't be used if they are not inherent. So Adriana, how about the first poll just to get a feel for who's on the call today?
Okay, now our poll is open. We are going to give 20 seconds to see all the answers. So the question is, does your food defense plan contain a written risk assessment of your vulnerabilities? This was something that we were also speaking on last week's webinar. Okay, so we are giving 5 seconds. Okay. So, Dr. Bob, we can see that 61% of the attendees answered yes, and 23% no, and 17% is not sure yet.
All right, well, that's encouraging because obviously if you've done the calculations and you've got the numbers and you can show the FDA, then obviously I believe you must have gone to the class, because otherwise this is difficult for you to know how the FDA wanted these calculations done. You could have got the materials from the FSPCA, which I did, in order to see what they were talking about. So let's talk about the vulnerability assessment. The calculations, there's a couple of ways that they're talking about you doing the calculations based on the potential public health impact. You can do it based on the volume of food at risk, and therefore how many single servings this equates to, and hence the number of people would be affected by getting sick or dying, and they award a score. So what does that mean? That means if you're making a batch of, let's say, a 500-pound batch, and then you're packing it off into 5-ounce packages or something, then the question is, how many packages would you make out of a 500-pound batch? And if that's the amount of food that one person would consume, then obviously that's the number of people who have the potential to get sick. If that's a bigger package and therefore it serves a family, then it serves a family of 3 and 4, then that would be 3 or 4 times each package divided obviously into the amount of product you're making. So do you get a feel for how the scoring has to be done? So therefore the question we asked, have you done this? And 61% believe said they had. Are you sure you did it this way? Because that's what the FDA is looking for. Because they want you to be able to say how many people, if the attacker was successful, could they get sick and kill? And therefore it's based on serving size of your product. Yes, it's a lot more than I thought it was going to be when the FDA initially introduced the fact that you're going to have a food defense plan, or an intentional adulteration plan, as they call it. The other way is to use a formula based on representative contaminant. And therefore now you have to say, well, how much would it take for the average body size? And that's why they came up with 204 pounds, is the average body size, obviously taking into account adults, taking into account male and female. And therefore, what would it take to kill a person who weighs 204 pounds? How much contaminant would it take in a product for them at one sitting to eat it and then die? And remember, the contaminant could be biological, chemical, radiological, or physical. The FDA won't give you a list of what things the person can add, because obviously then they're telling the attacker, by the way, don't try this, try this, try this. They will just give you a dose size and the amount of contaminants if you determine that you have a vulnerability and you are talking about a specific harmful contaminant that could be added. Having done the calculation on element 1, you then have to do the calculations on elements 2 and 3. And remember, the element 2 was physical access. So therefore, you have to do an estimate of how easy it is for the attacker to get to the product in order to add sufficient quantity of the contaminant in order to contaminate a lot of product. Element 3 is their ability to be successful, therefore be able to be over there adding it without creating suspicion and be able to walk away without being noticed and the product not to look different. So therefore, if they were successful in adding it, you would be packing off the product. Now, to calculate these two, you have to actually make calculations. And what it says is once you total up the scores, and we'll talk about how the scoring is proposed, then you would determine whether you've got a significant vulnerability or don't. And it would be a total of the 3 scores, the score for element 1, the score for element 2, and the score for element 3 added together. So I think some of you have said 61% are going back and saying, no, we don't have that, because I'm not sure a lot of people saw what was coming. Because in element 2, these calculations are based on judgment. On 1, they gave you and will give you, if you go to that class, much more guidance on how to calculate 1. 2, though, is more on judgment. It is you judging how easy is it for the person who's the attacker to get to the product. So therefore, one of the things you have to ask in your facility is access limited or not? If you've got a whole lot of product that is available for somebody to walk over and start dropping something in it. And remember, if it's a liquid, it's going to be easier to have it mix. And if it is powder, it's going to be a little more difficult. But if it's going to a mixer after they've dropped it in, that's going to be obviously much more vulnerable than if it's all going to head over and be packed into little packages. And they would have to stand there adding the product for the next half hour or something. I don't think anybody's going to have time to stand there adding something for a half hour. And if they can't add a significant amount, a small amount may not have the dramatic effect that they're looking to have. This one again is based on a calculation. How easy is it for them to contaminate, and how long would they have to stand there? And can you minimize that attack? Can you do something like lids on mixers? Mixers that if you open them, the motor kicks off, or an alarm goes off, covers over things. So it's very difficult to drop stuff in. These will be mitigation strategies, but what I'm talking about here is how you're going to deny the person the ability to get to the product. And if they can get to the product, deny them enough time to add sufficient quantity of something that would be hazardous to the health of the consumer. Because you're going to finish up scoring all of these. And the scores are going to be 10 is going to be the maximum score down to 1. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And if the 3 scores added together total more than 26, which you can do the calculations yourself, it actually goes 10, 8, 5, 3, and 1, I believe. I'll say it in a minute. Then to get a 26, you'd have to have 2 10s, meaning maximum vulnerability, and an 8. Then obviously that needs an actual process step. 14 to 25 requires a judgment to decide if one's needed. If the score is less than 14, the FDA is saying you do not require an actual process step, and therefore you would write that into your justification for not having one, and the FDA would agree, as long as you've done your calculations correctly. And if any element, any one of these three is a one, which means that either you can't add something to the product easily, you can't be successful in doing it, or what you're going to add is not going to have a public health significance, then obviously you don't have a vulnerability that is significant enough to even think about an actionable process step or invoking a mitigation strategy. Yes, this is a lot of stuff, and that in that class is what they talk about. So let's do a poll again now that you got a little bit more feel. So Adriana, can you do the second poll?
Yes. Okay. So the next poll is, which elements has your organization not yet identified? Element 1, public health impact. Element 2, ease of access. Element 3, ability to get contaminated. Or we have all elements covered. We are going to give 20 more seconds for you to select an answer. Okay, we're closing the poll now. And now we can see that 41% haven't identified the element 1, which is public health impact. And 36% have identified all elements, and 17% haven't identified element 3, ability to get contaminated, and only the 6%, the element 2, ease of access.
All right, well, obviously, if you haven't assessed ease of access, the others go along with that. But the public health impact, remember, you have to basically be able to say what you think somebody would add that would be of serious health consequences. And that's unfortunately, I think, one of the areas that's a little bit more difficult to assess what somebody's going to throw in the product. And with the FDA is not going to give you a list of what those things are, because then they would be telling the attacker, if I was you, I'd throw this in the product. It's getting a little bit more difficult to understand what are they talking about. Are they talking about throwing in a whole lot of salmonella? Are they talking about throwing in some type of hazardous chemical? Are they talking about throwing in some radiological hazard, etc.? In other words, that becomes one of the first things to know is what would the person do? Or do I take the worst case scenario and assume whatever they're throwing in there, they've worked out that it's going to be successful, so I have to assume that the attacker knows what they're doing. Then I get into trying to deny that access, and denying that access long enough for them to get a sufficient quantity in there. Because having determined that somebody is going to do this, and that's what the FDA is saying, you have to have that mindset. It's very difficult to have that mindset because you hope that people are not going to do it. You hope that they don't work in your plant or come in your plant, but you have to be one step ahead of them if they were to do it. And you have to assume, unfortunately, that it may happen, though you hope the probability is very low. And if the probability is not low, what are you doing to make sure that somebody of that like mind can't get to the product, can't add sufficient quantities, and cannot be successful? And therefore, it talks about an actionable process step. And what is the definition of that? It's a point, step, or procedure in your food process where you have determined a significant vulnerability exists. Therefore, it has a score of 26 or above on those three factors, or it's between 14 and 25, and you've said that I still believe it's significant, and that which mitigation strategies can be applied. So therefore, not only are you going to come up with an actual process step, but you're also going to make sure you've got something you can do about it called a mitigation strategy, which is designed to significantly minimize or prevent that vulnerability. In other words, take away the ability of the attacker to get to the product, or to be able to have enough time, if they can get to the product, And that doesn't mean that everybody can just put covers on and lids on and change their whole process so that it's impossible to get to it. But obviously, if your process is that you pump stuff into silos and you pump it from silos through pipes into mixers, and mixers are sealed, and you mix stuff together and you pump it over to a filler, and the filler is sealed and it goes into a container that's jammed up against a nozzle, I think you know that your vulnerability is a lot less than if you are conveying on belts a whole lot of product, or you've got a whole lot of product in mixers with no lids on them, or you've got access into a bulk storage area where somebody can just go in, climb up on top of a silo and drop something in because you don't have anything at the top to stop them doing that. That's what they're saying to you. Get into the mindset of the person who's going to try to do it. And there are many examples throughout the world. That's why we have to say at this stage, this is not just for us here in the United States of America or Canada. This is for around the world, because there are many examples of where contract employees, disgruntled employees, have gone ahead and contaminated food in many countries. And those are all available if you Google. So now you have to say, well, people are going to do it. They have done it, and we just don't want them to do it in our plant. So therefore you say to yourself, I've got to do these calculations. I've got to come up with the significance of the vulnerability. I've got to come up with the severity if they are successful. And based on that, then the scores are going to help me determine whether I have to have a mitigation strategy, and if so, which stage I have to have it. And then I better put that into effect, because if I don't, I've still got that significant vulnerability. So it says if any step in the process you score 1, so whether you score 1 on the public health impact, whether you scored a 1 on the ability to get to the product, or whether you scored a 1 on being successful in adding, then what the FDA is saying is they're not going to be successful. They're not going to be able to add significant quantities. Therefore, you don't have a significant vulnerability. But if you're going to be scoring the high 20s, you're going to be scoring something between 14 and 25, then you can't say, I don't have a vulnerability. Over 26, you're saying it's significant, I got to do something about it. Between 14 and 25, you may be able to justify that you don't, depending on which of the 3 scored somewhat lower than the other 2. So let's have a questions and answers. And again, what I would stress with you, everybody who's got the key activity types, everybody who's got product that is fitting into those key activity types, where you have those open mixing points, you have those bulk liquids, etc. Then I would say to you, I would highly recommend that you go to the FDA's class, which is put on by FSPCA, who are the same people who also developed the class for preventive controls for animal foods, preventive controls for human foods, and see how they tell you to do the vulnerability assessments. Because in there, it talks about you having to be a qualified individual. And if we talked about in the previous webinar, a qualified individual is somebody who either has extensive food defense knowledge from previous occupations or has had significant training in food defense. And the FDA's FSPCA class is considered to be one of the ways that you get that training. There are 2 classes online, as we talked about in the previous webinar, that you can do. And then the last one is to go and do the vulnerability calculations. You don't have key activity types. Therefore, you don't have the vulnerability that those with the key activity types have. Then I wouldn't recommend you go to that class. You may want to do the part 1 and part 2 online, but I wouldn't recommend that you go to the class and start doing calculations, because you are not considered the high-risk industries. So Adriana, do we have questions from people?
Yes, Dr. Buff, we have some questions. So the first one is key activity types is very specific about bulk liquid receiving and loading and liquid storage and handling. It doesn't say anything about bulk dry storage. Should these materials be considered the same way?
Yes, to the degree that they are bulk powders, but the fact is that if you drop something on the top of those, it's not going to mix into that bulk powder. Now, it depends on where that bulk powder is going, but it is a lot less vulnerable. So what the government is saying is, don't dismiss it as having no vulnerabilities, but it is not a key activity type.
Okay, the next question is, how do manufacturers who work in bulk score since it will not be in serving size measurements?
Say that again, please.
How do manufacturers who work in bulk score since it will not be in serving size measurements?
Well, somewhere down the road is going to get into serving size measurements. So whether you're packing a retail product off, clearly you are indicating on that package how many people it will feed. If you're making an ingredient and sending it to somebody else, then somebody else is going to be using it and it's going to finish up in the end being and then serving size. So that is a little bit more difficult to answer depending on whether you're an ingredient supplier or whether you're actually making a retail product.
Okay, next question is a Canadian site with US ownership considered an international supplier?
No, a Canadian site, no matter who owns it, is considered yes, they're considered an international supplier. And then you have to have what is the FSVP importer in the United States, which most likely would be the US owner, who most likely is based obviously in the United States. And they have to have the same things as if that facility in Canada was actually in a United States, one of the 50 United States. And so it does apply to you if your product is being sent into the United States. So remember now with the Safe Food for Canadians, you have to be licensed by the CFIA in order to make product, move it across provinces and to export it. You have to be registered with the FDA and the USDA if you're bringing products into the United States. Be careful on that because we are discovering, unfortunately, some Canadian companies who don't know that they have to now be licensed with CFIA. And some of them actually sending products into the United States, not realizing that they need an FSBP importer based in the United States. And that's one of the reasons why you have to have an FSBP importer, because they're supposed to make sure that anybody sending product into the United States has all these food safety modernization things, which includes a food defense plan. The only good news right now is for large companies that went into effect last month. Smaller companies have another year, and very small companies could be exempt, but they're going to have to prove to the FDA they're exempt. The FDA is not coming out to even see the large companies till March of next year. So it's not like somebody's going to come into your plant in Canada or in America in the next few months. But next February, the FDA will be knocking on somebody's door.
Okay, next question. Is there a difference between food fraud vulnerability assessment and the food defense vulnerability assessment?
Yes, these are different things because obviously food fraud is a economical thing where somebody is substituting a product for economic gain. That product could be hazardous to the health of the consumer, or it could not. So I'm not saying that food defense is not likely to be a vulnerability, but it's not the same as somebody standing in your plant deliberately adding something to the product. So food defense, food fraud are different programs.
Okay, next question is, if the facility is GFSI certified, are they already in compliance with FDI requirements for food defense? If
No,
not, what are the difference?
no. Because unless you've done all the things I've just talked about, I would say no. Now, why do I say no without seeing everybody's food defense plan? I am hazarding a guess because I know that back in the days when the GFSI was asking for food defense, everybody was putting together very simple food defense programs. Some companies, to be quite honest, would just pencil whipping something on a piece of paper to try and get the GFSI auditor to approve and move on and not take them any points. As the GFSI auditor got a little bit more knowledgeable, they put a little bit more into their food defense plans, and basically they still went where they needed to be. Now we've just seen that you have to do calculations on vulnerabilities as to severity and probability, and you have to be doing the scoring if you got the 4 KATs. And if you don't have the 4 KATs, yes, you have a simpler food defense plan. So I would say I don't think a lot of companies, unless they're really big and have studied this, and I'm talking about the big manufacturers, then I would say most of the medium-sized to small manufacturers are most likely not where they need to be.
The other question is how to verify effectiveness of food defense program beyond whether individuals can enter your facility.
Well, that is a question, because obviously you don't want to walk up and try to contaminate your product to see if you can successfully do it, which would be one of the ways that you would test the program out. But what you want to do is possibly have somebody who's a stranger come into your plant and see how your employees react when this person starts wandering around and they don't know them, and they go over to a mixer and they stand there and nobody does anything about it. Then you got a real problem in your plant, because you should have told your employees, if you see somebody you don't know, ask them the question, can I help you? If they indicate they're here to see somebody, then try to get them out the door by just saying, go out of that door over there, walk around the front of the plant and come in through the lobby. You got them out of the plant. You now determine, did they accidentally get in the plant, or were they in to do something that you didn't want them to do? That's one of the ways you would challenge your plan. You would also challenge your plan if you say that the mixer has a lid on it, and if you open it, it stops. Well, you go over there and open the lid, see if it stops. If it doesn't stop, then that means the attacker could have opened the lid, thrown something in, and you were relying on the fact that it would stop. It didn't stop. A door, which you said was closed and locked from the outside, you can pull it open. And I can keep on going on things where you could challenge your food defense plan. Some of them are simple, some of them are more complicated, but please don't try and throw anything in your product just to see if people would detect it.
Next question is, if you are not making retail product, how would you score? If a facility was selling bulk product not for retail and sold in bulk for further processes, how would that be scored?
You score it the same way, because if I'm buying an ingredient from you, which obviously I am, if you're not selling a retail product, you're selling a product for further processing, then the last thing I want you to do is not have a good food defense plan. Then you ship me an ingredient, it looks normal, it appears normal, it smells normal, I add it, it works normal, and all of a sudden you cause me a problem. It really doesn't matter in the food chain who's the one who gets a product delivery contaminated, it's still going to have a public health impact. So therefore, yes, you have to do this as well.
Okay, we have two more questions. How do you handle highly dangerous powder into your equations, since certain contaminant could have such a large impact in small quantities, while other powders would need large quantities to have an impact?
That's exactly where it's a little vague here, and that's why the FDA says you have to calculate based on the toxicity of whatever's been added, how much would it take? The FDA is not going to give you a list, but if you do contact the FDA and you pick something and you say, how much would it take of this to be added to my product? Therefore, what percentage? Would it need to be 1%, half a percent? for it to be successful. The FDA has indicated they will answer those questions specifically for you, but they will not give you a list of the things that you should be worried about. But you have to pick them yourself. And that's when it becomes a little vague, but they will help you with the calculations.
Okay, and the last question is, could you recommend a class for food contact material, more specific paper?
Well, food contact materials actually are exempt from FSMA in the United States. If they're coming from outside the United States, they are not exempt from FSMA. The thing about it is nobody believes that anybody's going to be able to smear something all over food contact packaging to the degree that it would get people sick. Therefore, it would migrate into a food product. So I would not put food packaging on the list of what I'm going to spend a whole lot of time doing calculations, and that's why it's not a key activity type. But I still would say to you as a food packaging manufacturer outside the United States, and remember the FDA is considering spatulas and slices and dices and cutting boards and everything in food contact, not just food contact packaging. And some of that's been delayed as far as FSMA until 2022. But all of that stuff coming into the United States is going to have to be proven to be approved for food contact. I don't think the FDA sees that as a big source of people trying to get people sick and kill them with something that may be on that type of material or could leach out of that type of material.
Okay, Dr. Bob, we got a last question. What should I consider whole mushrooms and the potential for them to be contaminated?
Well, it's very difficult for something like that. I'd be more worried about getting into the poisonous mushrooms than I would something else. So I imagine one of the things that could happen there is if somebody was able to get poison mushrooms into your facility, and they look very much like the non-poisonous type, and they could be mixed in, could I therefore again get people sick and kill them because I mixed into your good edible mushrooms some non-edible toxic mushrooms? Again, how many would people eat? How successful would they be? Do the inedible mushrooms look different enough that somebody would go, well, these don't look right? I leave that up to you as you're in the mushroom industry, as being having your employees trained to recognize if somebody tries to put in an inedible toxic mushroom into my mushrooms.
Okay, that was the last question. Thank you, Dr. Buff, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. I just remember you that we are going to send you the webinar replay in an email in the next days. And thank you a lot for your participation and your support, Dr. Bob.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.